Welcome and good morning to today's webinar on introducing the Prewave Action Platform. A few words on the logistics first. The webinar will be recorded. We will share the slides and also the recording afterwards with all participants. And also you have the ability to ask questions with the Q&A function. We will have an eye on it during the webinar, but we'll also definitely get to it at the end of the webinar. I have the pleasure to have Sebastian Rünz with me today in this webinar. He will start with giving a quick overview of the legal requirements based on the German Supply Chain Act, the European CS3D, on what it means to take action with suppliers and especially appropriate action with suppliers. And then I will give an introduction of the Prewave Action Platform, which is precisely this missing puzzle piece of allowing companies to not just identify risks, but actually effectively mitigate them with action partners. And with that, I say welcome to Sebastian and hand over. Feel free to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about the legal requirements for what it means to take appropriate action.
Yeah, thank you very much, Harald. My name is Sebastian Rünz. I'm a salary partner at Taylor Wessing in Düsseldorf and focusing on the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act a lot. And yeah, I think probably most of you have seen some webinars with Harald and me, so I won't make it too long and we can start right away and take a look at the different legal developments we can see, in particular in Europe. So on this slide, you can see different regulation that came up during the last years or are still coming up. The German Supply Chain Act as the first comprehensive supply chain due diligence act in Europe. Then the Norwegian Transparency Act, which entered into force already. The not that far-reaching Swiss legislation, and of course on the European level the CSDDD, which is not final yet. We have different drafts of the Parliament, of the Commission, of the European Council, and now trilogue will start between those institutions, and we expect a directive to be final probably during the next year, with some period for transformation into national law. So this will still take a while till we have a final European directive, but still you can see there is a lot of new legislation going on in Europe, and all these laws, they have a lot of similarities because in the end, they are based on the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, which also have been addressed in various OECD guidelines. So you will find in all these laws a certain set of core due diligence regulations companies need to comply with, which is basically a risk management. So you need the responsibilities in your company, a risk analysis. You can see this here on the right side, which are the different sections in the respective laws talking about risk analysis, preventive and remedial actions. You can see this here on the bottom left side. Appropriate measures, which could be preventive and remedial measures, depending on whether you identified just a risk or a violation already. And of course, in the end, reporting obligations. So according to all these laws, you need to report once a year on your fulfillment, on how you have complied with the due diligence obligations. There are this is basically the core. Of course, there are differences between the laws when you look at applicability, on the size of companies the laws are addressing, on sanctions, on liability, on protected humans and environmental rights. So there are differences, but I think the first key takeaway is that there are a lot of similarities, and you can find a set of core due diligence obligations in all those laws.
Mm-hmm.
On this slide, you can see, based on the German Supply Chain Act and also on the European CSDDD, which are the measures the legislator had in mind when they drafted those laws. We divided it into preventive measures in your own business area and with respect to your suppliers, and remedial measures in your own business area and with respect to your suppliers. So let's start on the top left side, preventive measures in your own business area. What does that mean? It means you should have a human rights strategy implemented in your company. You should have procurement strategy and purchasing practices that are reflecting human rights risks. You should train your relevant business areas. So training, you can see training comes up in your own business area and also on the right side with respect to suppliers, but we'll get to this later. You should do risk-based control measures. Of course, you need to verify whether the law is implemented correctly in your own company, and that's like a typical thing. Also, when you look at compliance management systems, you need to do have risk-based controls to see whether everything works smoothly. And something very interesting, which can be found in the CSDDD, a very broad term. It's hard to understand right now. What does the legislator mean? So far, we are missing the handouts of the European legislator explaining what exactly companies need to do, but that's changes in investments. So when you look at the CSDDD, you can find this preventive measures with some examples. For example, changes when you look at your production, at your facilities, product traceability, which is basically very far-reaching, because it tells the company how they have to design their products, how so at a very early stage in your value chain. According to the legislator, you should think, what can I do to reduce human rights and environmental risks that are related to the product? On the right side, with respect to suppliers, you also have preventive measures. First one would be, you should consider human rights related risks when you select your suppliers. So you should include your expectations with respect to human rights that you have for your suppliers. Then you should assure this in contracts, for example, in a supplier code of conduct. Here, the next point is the supplier training. So not only training in your own business area, but also with respect to the suppliers. Cooperation and support of suppliers, that's also something in particularly mentioned in the CSDDD. Risk-based control measures, again, which at the supplier level could be named audits. You should perform audits at your suppliers, not only rely on contractual assurances, for example, or certificates, but with respect at least to high-risk suppliers, also to perform audits. And cooperate with other companies in industry initiatives, for example, to increase the influence you might have on risky suppliers. When you look at the remedial measures in your own business area, it's important to mention that at least under the German Supply Chain Act, the legislator expects companies to bring violations to an end. You can see we added the word usually. This depends on whether we look at the own business area in your own company in Germany or abroad, depending on whether it's in Germany. So in Germany, you would need to bring violations to an end, abroad, usually to an end. It's a slight difference, but it's important to mention because usually the legislator just requires companies to use best efforts to minimize human rights risks. But with respect to your own business area, it's not only best effort, you need to end any violation you found in your own company. With respect to suppliers, of course, you could also try to end it right away, the violation. If that's not possible, you need to introduce a concept to end or minimize violations with a concrete timetable. And this concept should include, of course, first you need to address the violations you found out with your suppliers, tell the supplier to stop it. If it doesn't work, then you should think of, again, cooperating with other companies to increase your influence. As a next step, you should think of suspension of the business relationship, and as a last resort, the legislator speaks of termination of business relationships, but that's not what the legislator wants, neither on the German level nor the European level. But it's basically a last resort, and but the general idea of the legislator is that German companies, they just don't stop any presence in a risky country, but more try to improve the situation, even if it's connected with risks.
And these various measures, they are typically also reflected, for instance, in the BAFA reporting requirements, right, Sebastian?
Correct. So basically, you need to explain to the BAFA in your report which measures you took and why. So that's, I think, a very important point. And maybe we can go on the next slide because it's connected to this one. All these measures we were just talking about, you don't need to take all these measures with respect to all of your suppliers. That's, of course, so the legislators, they want, they are talking of a risk-based approach. So you would need to look here, we included the appropriateness criteria of the German Supply Chain Act. You need to look at these criteria and then decide which measures make sense. So if you have maybe clustered your suppliers in low-risk suppliers, medium-risk suppliers, high-risk suppliers, then, for example, with the low-risk suppliers, it may be sufficient just to use a code of conduct. It of course depends on the individual situation, but there we have a set of preventive measures which are not that far-reaching, which are sufficient for the low-risk suppliers. Medium-risk suppliers, of course, then you would already require more, and high-risk suppliers, then you would need to focus on them and see, what do I need to do? Do I need to conduct audits? Do I need to change my procurement practices? Because maybe I'm contributing to the problem based on my contract design, on low prices, on high volumes, which need to be delivered in a very short time. So you need to basically evaluate this criteria and then decide with respect to your categorized suppliers which measures are appropriate and which measures you want to take. And this is basically at the discretion of the companies. The legislator doesn't say you have to do it exactly this or that way. So in the end, companies need to document it, and that's a very important point. You need to document why you took certain measures and why you didn't take other measures, or just took those measures for just a certain number of suppliers which are connected with high risks. So that's a very important takeaway. So the legislator basically requires companies to do this in the background, weighing the appropriateness criteria, and then decide based on the weighing and prioritization which measures to take.
And for actual violations in the own business area, do these appropriateness criteria also apply, or these are then cases where you must remediate in any case?
They also apply, which is a little bit strange, because the legislator says you need to bring violations to an end. So you could say, no matter how I look at the appropriateness criteria, I need to end the violation. But still, at least if you look at the handouts of the BAFA, you would also need to do this. But bear in mind that's more, at least from our perspective, more for documentation reasons than for reasons not to address every problem in your own business area. In your own business area, it's basically if you when you find something out that's some risks or violations, you should really do your best to bring this to an end and report in the BAFA report that you brought it to an end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, makes sense. And they typically must be evaluated in combination with each other, right? So it's always kind of
right. Here you can see a suggestion which can be found in the handout on identifying, weighing, and prioritizing risks of the BAFA. So on the left side, you can find the criteria mentioned in the German Supply Chain Act. On the right side, you can find some examples. So what does basically nature and scope of business activity means? It means the complexity of products, the variety of services, or what does influence means? It basically, or it could in particular mean the order volume related to the entire revenue of the supplier. You could use that, go through it, tick the box, and then basically have a scheme and say, okay, when I tick those boxes, this tells me that the appropriateness criteria are pretty strong, so I should take more far-reaching measures, or this tells me, okay, the appropriateness criteria cannot, well, there are not that many appropriateness criteria speaking for far-reaching measures. That's why I only took a certain limited number of preventive or remedial measures.
Yeah, excellent. And yeah, we also have several webinars, Sebastian and myself, on elaborating on these topics in detail. They can also be found in our YouTube channel, which we will also share afterwards. But I think, so this was, let's say, an overview of the fundamental legal requirements. So the necessity to have, let's say, an end-to-end approach from identifying risks to mitigating them to reporting them, and to have also this understanding of various appropriate measures that are possible. Again, we are looking at this from a legal due diligence perspective, but I will also highlight now in the upcoming part a few aspects because the fundamental principles, of course, also apply to disruption risks in supply chain and having secure and stable supply chains. So going back to this slide, the goal of our system at Prewave that we offer to customers is precisely to work along this risk management cycle in an end-to-end fashion. So to be able to conduct a risk analysis within the tool that is matching the criteria of the legal requirements, that are then highlighting the risks, that are then, let's say, giving the ability to take measures and document these measures and report on them. And if we now, let's say, focus on this topic that we have today, which is taking actions with suppliers, it is about going from a status of having certain prioritized risks towards a status of having mitigated risks. And this is precisely the journey that needs to be done, and that also this risk management cycle is all about taking action on those risks that are, let's say, prioritized. And our core, let's say, tool to prioritize risk is the risk matrix. And this risk matrix is both used when it comes to evaluating disruption risks in order to increase the resilience of supply chains, or it's used from the perspective of human rights or environmental due diligence in order to increase the, let's say, sustainability or the compliance of the supply chain with those laws. And the way this tool is set up, and what you see here is typically the outcome of the first part of this risk management lifecycle, which is the risk analysis, which is where we combine various automated sources around industry risks, country risks, location-based risks, but also media screening. So have there been issues in the past with a supplier? Meaning that on the x-axis, we would have what's in Prewave called the 360-degree risk score, which is a combination of these factors. So here, a supplier that is located towards the right of the matrix would be a supplier that has, for instance, some country or location risk. Maybe they are located in a country for a higher likelihood for human rights violations, or they are located in an area with a higher likelihood for earthquakes. And they might have also had some issues in the past around these topics. Maybe they had some health and safety issues in the past that have been reported and that we picked up. All of that would mean a supplier is located towards the right part of the risk matrix. But then we have the second axis, which is the impact axis, which differs from the either human rights due diligence or the resilience perspective. From the resilience perspective, the y-axis can be maybe summarized in how important is this supplier for my supply chain, meaning how much am I dependent on that supplier, based on having this as a single source, based on having this as a highly specialized supplier that I can only replace over a longer period of time. I have maybe not that much stock available. All of these would be factors that make this supplier very critical to my supply chain. From the topic of human rights due diligence that Sebastian was introducing in the beginning, this is then a different perspective, because here the impact is measured also in the Prewave system based on a combination of influence and contribution. So in the top right and in the upper part of this matrix, we would have suppliers where we have influence and leverage, and we may have also contribution towards the risk that is detected. Meaning a supplier here that is also here highlighted would be a supplier where we have both risk but also influence, typically that is measured by, as Sebastian also mentioned, the let's say share of our own spend to the overall revenues of that supplier. So do we account for a significant size of the revenues of that supplier? And that means now understanding this matrix, and this is again what we produce after an initial phase of risk analysis for a customer. Our customer is now faced with the task to improving the risk profile of his supply chain. And this can now happen exactly along these two dimensions again. So the first dimension to now move such a critical supplier to maybe a yellow or green profile can be to reduce the impact of that supplier. So from a resilience or disruption perspective, this would mean we qualify a second source, we increase safety stock, or from the, we might redesign some of our products to utilize less of that. And from a due diligence perspective, it would mean to reduce the relationship with that supplier. Again, this is also what Sebastian mentioned in the beginning, investment redesigning products, but also qualifying alternative suppliers that are less risky, would lead to having less spend with that supplier, would mean the share of revenues would decline, and the supplier would be moved with the same risk profile from red to yellow. Now, the positive of moving the supplier and improving the supplier along the impact axis is it's typically our customer's direct sphere of influence. So you can decide to do that and you can reduce the relationship. But this is, of course, easier said than done because this is typically quite a costly process. Redesigning process is products is a long-term investment depending on the product cycles, 3 to 5 years, shorter or longer depending on the industry. But it's a longer-term process. Also, qualifying second source suppliers, diversifying comes at a cost. So let's look at the other dimension that we have. And the other dimension that we can improve suppliers is along the risk axis. And by taking appropriate measures that actually reduce the risk, the likelihood for a adverse impact or adverse event happening at that supplier. And this is typically measures where we can or where we work to develop the capacity and maturity of that supplier to avoid risks, where we increase or try to bring the supplier to increase standards in the operations. Trainings, certifications play a crucial role. If I can share a personal example from Prewave, as a software provider that deals with supplier information, the main risk that we pose to our customers is information security risk. So therefore, we are taking measures based also on the urging of our customers to increase our standards. And we are certified, for instance, under TSEX, so the ISO 27001 standard from the automotive industry. And we had to take measures to increase our maturity and capacity around information security. So these are the two dimensions that we can work with, and the ability to reduce risk at suppliers from the perspective of a customer sometimes can be a bit harder because it depends on the leverage you have over that supplier. It's not your direct sphere of influence, but it can often be a much faster and more effective and oftentimes much less expensive way to actually move a supplier from the red to the yellow or the green. And this dimension of the risk and building capacity is precisely the topic that of today's webinar, which is, let's say, introducing a new functionality at Prewave to work with suppliers to build this capacity. If we are honest with ourselves, and I'm speaking here for Prewave, but maybe also on the supply chain risk software ecosystem in general, I think the ecosystem is still lacking in this dimension. Yeah, it's for instance, as Prewave, so far we have offered ability to plan measures. So I document and plan measures, which is of course good, but it's not enough because it's important to not just plan measures, but to actually implement them. And many of our customers, they do have, let's say, the issue of identifying with whom can I take the right measures, who is the right partner for that. It's typically a broad mix of measures that is necessary to build this capacity and maturity with suppliers. We are here talking about audits and certifications. There are specialized companies that do that, desk audits, supplier engagement, so working with suppliers in various ways to increase their capacity and maturity, training of suppliers, or then consulting that is needed around that to identify the right mix of actions and the right system of consequences to take these actions. Let's say this is also, again, to refer back to Sebastian's slide here, also the requirement of these due diligence laws, such as the German Due Diligence Act or the European CSDDD, is to precisely have this mix of measures that they also require in the reporting. There are existing initiatives to take actions, and they are great and important. Yeah, initiatives like the RSCI, which is an automotive industry initiative that harmonizes audit standards for suppliers, and also built around sharing the results. So this is, I think, very important. Same goes for other audit initiatives or other providers that offer desk audits and ratings of suppliers. The downside, however, of these are that oftentimes they are constrained to certain industries. They are constrained to just one type of action. And that leaves, especially many of the customers we work with, oftentimes they are not part yet of any such initiative, or if they are, they have the question of how can we integrate that, and what is really an approach to take these measures on a complete level, yeah, across these various types of measures, and where do we integrate those and how do we integrate those. So this is why we have been working on a functionality that we call Action Platform that precisely solves this missing puzzle piece of how can our customers take effective actions with various partners. And this is what the Prewave Action Platform is all about. So we have been working with various partners, Taylor Wessing being one of them, to bring them into this action platform. It is a system that allows our existing customer base, which today are more than 100 customers that are working with us on these various topics of either supply chain due diligence or resilience, to take action with partners through one cohesive platform to mitigate risks with their risk suppliers. And it's precisely this mix of actions that are now possible with validated and vetted partners, audit and certification providers like TÜV Süd, so companies with a strong reputation and capacity to work globally on those topics, supplier engagement providers such as Ulula or the Rainforest Foundation on the topics of deforestation, companies dedicated to providing awareness trainings for risk suppliers, especially in also non-English speaking countries like Quizzer, and then various consulting partners who are experts in the areas of taking the appropriate actions and implementing processes such as learning, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Valantic, that are offering services also sometimes in various of these action types. And the goal is then to have the action platform be integrated into the Prewave Risk Scorecard. So this is precisely this missing puzzle piece that is currently there, that when you audit, when you train a supplier, when you work with a supplier, all of that needs to feed back into the scorecard of the supplier in order to have an impact on the score. We see a risk supplier, we audit them. A good audit should improve the score and precisely turn this supplier from red to yellow or green. And the same holds true for training or any other measures. And we also need these measures integrated in order to report then in a cohesive way to the authorities, but to also monitor the impact of the actions we take over time. So are we really improving our risk profile, or are these actions that we are taking effective or not? And this is then an internal monitoring. But the requirement is to have all of that integrated into the scorecard. Now, the actions that we provide, they are typically oriented in along the dimensions of resource intensity and effectiveness. So we have a classification system of actions. Here are actions around the due diligence topic to take appropriate measures, where we have a code of conduct, for instance, as a measure of low severity, going all the way then to an on-site audit as the measure with the highest effectiveness, but also typically the highest cost. And the way of the action platform that we are pursuing is to precisely model the actions also along our funnel approach. So those familiar with the Prewave system know that we start in the risk-based funnel approach with all suppliers. We first apply a country industry scoring. We then apply the historical media screening to further understand the risk profile of those suppliers. This is, we also call it 360-degree scoring. And then together with the impact dimension, have the risk matrix. And it is then precisely the action platform that applies for those risk suppliers. So those that are in the red or dark red part of the risk matrix. We call this also high or critical action priority. And we then stagger or apply the actions along the funnel with the most intensive measures applied towards the end of the funnel. So how does this work in practice? And I brought here an example of a typical, let's say, medium-sized manufacturing company. They have maybe 2,000 suppliers overall. And after a first risk analysis, we have 100 risk suppliers. So suppliers with both risk and impact in the top right of the risk matrix. And the action platform is now a systematic way to move these suppliers through the funnel and reduce risk along the way. The first measure that we bring through the action platform is what we call the maturity assessments. The maturity assessments are a new functionality we have to identify publicly available certifications, policies, audit reports, and other indicators that we use to measure the maturity of that supplier without asking the supplier. For instance, do they have a grievance mechanism published on their website? Are they showing ISO certifications around the critical topics like ISO 14001 for environmental standards, 45,000 for health and safety at the workplace? Have they been audited? Do they maybe publish some audit reports on their website? And many of them do. And if they do, we grab these certifications, these policies, we validate them and add them to the scorecard of that supplier. And we have so far accomplished this for several thousand of suppliers. And we have an average of a 50% success rate. So without the need to actually ask the suppliers with self-assessments, we can actually already move a lot of them from, let's say, being red or yellow into the green, because the existence of certifications is an indication of higher capacity and maturity at the supplier. For those suppliers where we don't find any available certifications, we then approach them with self-assessments. And this is precisely also the point of the Prewave model and also the action platform, is to apply, let's say, the interactive part and the collaborative part with the supplier at the late stage in the funnel. So many alternative solutions, they typically have an approach where after a first evaluation of country industry risk, then you go out with self-assessments to all of these suppliers. And in my previous example of this 2,000 supplier medium-sized company, that could be 1,000 suppliers that are then sent self-assessments. But that produces a lot of effort internally, and it also produces a lot of effort at suppliers who in many cases actually have are located or don't have a high risk profile, and also in many cases have these certifications anyway publicly available on their website. So we then apply the self-assessments only to those where we have not found them publicly. With self-assessments with a certain answering rate, how many can actually provide policies and certifications? Let's say it's 50% that either answer, and if they answer good. So those we also don't need to go further because they can then demonstrate certifications. So the actual then actions of severity level 3 and 4 are then left for a only quite small number of suppliers. So training, service, and desk audits, you have 25 suppliers here left that are after risk, after self-assessments and maturity assessments, still in the red. So those would be then ones where we apply worker surveys, awareness trainings, desk audits. And for those that after those measures still have high risk, we then apply on-site audits. And in rare circumstances, the decision to discontinue the relationship with that supplier, either temporarily or permanently. In this case, let's say a very small 0.1% of all suppliers, actually 0.1%. And that way we can move them through the funnel and mitigate those risks in a very effective manner. Now, the action platform does not just offer the ability to take actions with suppliers, with the partners, but it also brings various benefits by itself. The first benefit of being in the action platform is that we do these maturity assessments for all risk suppliers. The second benefit is that many of our action partners are offering premium self-assessments for dedicated areas. Sebastian will introduce one of them, which are Taylor Wessing checklists for risk assessments for the own business area. So these are typically more extensive self-assessments. But also one of our partners, Löring, has a longer, more detailed human rights self-assessment. We also allow unlimited access to platform actions. So as part of the action platform, we also as Prewave will invest in actions proactively, and suppliers are also able to take actions that they themselves are pay for with our partners. And if they do, these actions are then available and the suppliers can share them with all members of the action platform. Our members of the action platform will also be able to take these shared actions. We call these action task forces. So if our 100+ customers identify risks at a shared supplier, they can combine the efforts and jointly take action with that supplier. And this is precisely also this point that Sebastian mentioned in the beginning of cooperating between companies on an industry level to combine the leverage over that supplier. A main benefit of the action platform is also that it doesn't require additional contracting. So you contract once with Prewave to become a member of the action platform, and you can then execute these actions through the action platform without the need to contract with each individual partner around audits or trainings. And last but not least, all actions that are taken with these partners are then integrated back into the Prewave 360-degree scorecard seamlessly so that you can then report to the authorities. And now I want to introduce some of the action partners. And with that, the first action partner I have with me today is Sebastian Rünz, Taylor Wessing. And I would like to hand back to Sebastian to show some of the services that Taylor Wessing is offering for the action platform.
Yeah, thank you. So let me show you what we as Taylor Wessing offer in the Prewave Action Platform. So the first thing is we developed questionnaires for the risk analysis in your own business area. The risk analysis in the own business area has to be conducted in greater depth and more detail. When you look, in particular, when you look at the handouts provided by the authorities so far, they basically say, in particular, in the handout related to appropriateness, when you conduct your risk analysis in your own business area, you should use coordinators, you should use local contacts, you should use questionnaires, you should do interviews. So initially, when companies started to implement the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, they were focusing on the suppliers, which makes sense and which is still right. But this shifted a little bit, and it became clear that companies also need to look in detail at their own business area. So we developed these questionnaires, which basically ask questions on all the human rights and environmental risks mentioned in the Supply Chain Act, so that a responsible person in the company could go through the checklists, the questionnaires, and thereby verify whether you have any risks in your own business area or not. Of course, with respect to certain risks, this will be over pretty fast when you think of child labor or forced labor, but the German Supply Chain Act mentions other human rights risks, such as occupational safety, health and safety, or discrimination. So with respect to those topics, you could think a little bit more in detail, do we have any problems in this regard or not? And these questionnaires help by doing that, so that you don't need to ask someone into your company, do we have a problem? And they respond, well, I don't think so. You can give them the questionnaires and they go through it, and thereby have a certain structure that helps them to understand what does the German Supply Chain Act understand under occupational safety and health or under discrimination, and verify whether there are any problems in the company in this regard.
And they are fully integrated into the Prewave system and can send like any other self-assessment and tracked and followed up upon. And that's already done. So if you're interested, just let us know. Various of our customers are already using these checklists.
Perfect. So the next thing is an e-learning. We are co-developing with Prewave. Why are we doing that? Because when you look at the law, you can find a passage in the law that's basically saying that you have to do that. So the German Supply Chain Act requires training of your own employees in the relevant departments. And when you look at the explanation to the respective section in the law, it's written that appropriate training should ensure that the company's own employees are aware of the human rights strategy, and that, for example, purchasers should be trained. So that's why we are developing this e-learning. It looks basically like an e-learning you might know from different topics like anti-money laundering, e-learnings you are used to when you're working at a company, and it's connected basically with a quiz at the end of the e-learning. So you have to pass the test to get a certificate saying, okay, now you have passed the German Supply Chain Act training. We are not fully done yet. We are still developing it. We are expecting it to be finalized in July. And for now, we started to have a pre-registration for you. So perfect, thanks, Harald. So you can pre-register if you are interested in this e-learning addressed to your own employees in your companies on the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. We will send you this form after the webinar. So if you're interested, just tell us your name, your email, and then we are getting back to you as soon as we have the e-learning ready. And as I said, it will take some more time, but not that much time anymore. So we expect it to be ready in the next 4 or 6 weeks, so that companies could use it. And the last thing I wanted to mention, service of Taylor Wessing on the Action Platform, it's consulting packages. So basically you can book consulting day, consulting half day on certain legal topics, for example, sanity check of your report, which basically looks at it at major gaps, at weaknesses, trying to improve some passages, maybe think of what's the best strategy to present your the risks you identified to the BAFA. Harald said, typically you don't need to have a separate engagement letter with the partners, and that's true, except for us, because we are basically bound by law as lawyers. So you would need to, if you would like to have the consulting packages, enter into an engagement letter with us. But that's the exception. All the other partners don't require that. Yeah, so these are the services Taylor Wessing provides on the Prewave Action Platform.
Yeah, and thank you, Sebastian, again for working with us along all of these various areas. I think it's really great to have, for instance, around the topic of the e-learning, the input and the domain expertise on having both an easy to understand, but also really in terms of content, very valid and good training, and then also these services. Sanity check on the BAFA report is, I think, something that a lot of people will be interested in when the time comes. Yeah. So,
and it's good that you mention it again, because we also looked at the market, and so far I wasn't able to find a really good quality e-learning on the German Supply Chain Act, because if you're not working with the Supply Chain Act every day as a lawyer advising companies, it's quite difficult to develop an e-learning. So in that e-learning, really all our expertise went to this e-learning, and we tried to develop an e-learning that's not only on the surface, so that is going into the details, but still explaining it to your employees in a simple and comprehensible way.
Absolutely. All right. So before we go into the Q&A, a few last points of information. So first of all, what's the business model and how does it apply? So this action platform is available for all new customers that want to work with Prewave, but also all existing customers as a add-on package to the typical package of risk analysis and monitoring that we offer. And the package is sized on the number of risk suppliers. So it precisely applies at the end of the funnel. And the package is, as I shown here from this example case, of 2,000 initial suppliers, 100 risk suppliers, then built on having access to all of the benefits of the platform, shared actions, platform actions, maturity assessments, and then a certain mix of actions that will also be tailored to our customers. Some customers might have more necessity or impulse to do audits. Some customers would like to be more on the, let's say, more efficient and digital measures like worker surveys and trainings. But this action mix is not set in stone. It is just the sizing of the package, which for this action mix here, for this customer of 2,000 suppliers, initially 100 risk suppliers, we would be looking at a annual package of 30,000 per year. Sorry, that's a typo here. 30,000 euro per year annual subscription. The platform will launch on September 2023. Currently, we have pilot phases ongoing with existing customers. The pioneer packages that I just showed you, with also special pricing, are available at the end of this year. And the action platform is there for all new and existing customers. Now, we also want to introduce our other action partners, and that's why we are starting a webinar series around the action platform that will happen throughout the rest of the summer. We are starting with webinars that are already scheduled with our partners Quizza on July 12th. Quizza is a provider of supplier trainings, awareness trainings, specialized around low resource languages and countries where risk suppliers are oftentimes situated, such as in Southeast Asia, East Asia, or South America. And very excited about having a webinar with them on July 12th. Ulula is a provider of supplier engagement tools, such as worker surveys. So in certain circumstances, it can be helpful as additional control measure, but also, let's say, risk identification measure to actually quiz and ask the workers of the supplier around various topics, such as health and labor related issues, human rights issues, and get the direct worker feedback. And Ulula is specialized in having a very efficient and scalable process. And on the 18th of June, July, and on the 26th of July, webinar with Löding, who is also offering services around both consulting, trainings, and desk audits. And also the other partners such as TÜV Süd and PwC, Valantic, we will also have webinars coming up that will be still announced in terms of the date. And with that, we go to the Q&A session. If you're interested in getting a demo or a precise quotation on the action platform, reach out to us afterwards. But now I will have a look through the questions. I think there might be one question that you could answer, Sebastian. If a German company has an entity in a risk country and the German company buys products from the risk country via its own entity, is the entity the tier 1 supplier? Sorry, can you? I have a hard time now.
No, I can answer it. So is the entity the tier 1 supplier, or are the suppliers for your own subsidiary the tier 1 supplier? So this basically depends on whether you have decisive influence on your own entity located in Germany or in another country. If you have decisive influence as the German parent company, this subsidiary will be considered to be part of the German company with respect to the German Supply Chain Act. And in that regard, this subsidiary wouldn't be the tier 1 suppliers, but the suppliers of this subsidiary would be the tier 1 suppliers of the whole company, meaning the German company and the subsidiary combined. So in the beginning, that wasn't 100% clear, but now the BAFA basically they positioned themselves in one of the guidelines, saying if you have decisive influence as a German company on a subsidiary, then you have to look also at the suppliers of your subsidiary. This, of course, extends the scope of suppliers you need to look at dramatically, but that's what the authorities are saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sebastian. Then I see a few questions around what the measures are geared towards. Are the measures only in scope for human rights risks, or also other risk types? So given the, let's say, immediate need from these various due diligence legislations, we are basically starting with offering measures on the action platform, mainly around these human rights and environmental related risk factors. But it's really the goal and the plan to also extend the action platform into other risk areas, improving also then the resilience of your supply chain, the maturity and capacity of your suppliers around other topics that are more operationally relevant. So that could be information security, that could be quality, that could be safety standards around fire safety and accident protection and so on. is it common for your customers to be utilizing multiple supply chain risk software companies simultaneously, like using Prewave and EcoVadis? It happens, and it's something we definitely, let's say, see from time to time, and it makes sense. Yeah, I mean, EcoVadis is certainly a way to work at the end of the funnel. In this case, since typically our customers work with Prewave at the beginning of the funnel on the risk assessment, we have all or the substantial suppliers in Prewave, and can then track also EcoVadis as measures in Prewave, and would like to then feed back also the EcoVadis rating into the Prewave scorecard to have this closed loop, so that we can then report for all suppliers and these measures we took with, for instance, an EcoVadis out of the Prewave system. So that definitely happens, and can be an approach that also makes sense. Yeah. On the other hand, we of course have many customers that are not working with EcoVadis yet. We have many customers that are also not yet part of an existing audit initiative. The RSCI, as I said, is currently only for the automotive industry. Amfori oftentimes more focused on certain industries, and many of the customers that we are facing are more medium-sized companies in the manufacturing industry, and they typically are also new to taking these types of actions with their suppliers. How do you integrate media monitoring with the survey on certificates? There can still be adverse impacts even if there's a certificate in place. That's exactly right. And that's why we have the evaluation of a supplier around the 360-degree model, where one component is the assessment component, where, for instance, you can add either through the maturity assessment, through a self-assessment, through a desk audit, that the supplier is certified and is following certain standards and policies, which has a positive impact on the risk. But if then tomorrow we do detect a severe human rights risk via media monitoring, that affects the media part of the scorecard. We call it the alert score, which can then severely reduce again the risk score of that supplier. Again, move that supplier from a maybe yellow or green supplier into the red, based on these experience of recent risks that happened at that supplier. And that's precisely what you want, is this integrated scorecard, where yes, we have certain actions, but we monitor suppliers whether they are also let's say sticking to these policies that they have decided for themselves, and whether they are actually having the maturity they appear to have based on the certifications. If you're already customers of Prewave, do we have to pay extra for the Action Platform? Yes, so the Action Platform is an add-on also for existing customers. But of course, you can have, let's say, an entry package. We have even now some customers that are just interested in the maturity assessments and one or two of the actions that are offered on the platform. And that's also, of course, a possibility. Can the results of the risk analysis be customized individually? Yes, of course. So there's various ways to apply various thresholds, prioritize certain risks, also based on your own scope of business, your own industry, where you see priorities in your risk analysis. Do I have to check every news alert that I get from Prewave? I'm a medium-sized company, and that could be a lot of effort. I'm paraphrasing the question. No, you don't. And we have had a webinar last Friday, actually, where we precisely demonstrated the methodology that we suggest and also have implemented. You only process the critical alerts, so those that directly relate, for instance, to the criteria of the German Supply Chain Act. So is there a severe human rights issue at a direct supplier, then you process it. But for a medium-sized company, let's say with these 2,000 suppliers, that is a very rare occurrence, yeah, that such an alert actually appears in the system. If, for example, Taylor Wessing's e-learning is contracted for one's own business area via the Action Platform, and the training is carried out, will this automatically lead to an improvement in the 360-degree score of its own company? Yes. First of all, we want to mention also that the e-learning is not just available for the Action Platform members, but that is actually a service we also offer standalone. But yes, if you complete the e-learning, that will be then similarly to a supplier having completed an awareness training around health and safety. All of these actions have a certain impact on the risk scorecard, and because they are maturity and capacity building. Yeah. How does the order work and what is the process through the Action Platform? So you contract with us on an annual contract for the Action Platform based on a desired action mix, and you can then call based on credits you receive that are aligned with this action mix you want to take, meaning you're not tied to then doing 2 audits. You can also do trainings instead of audits, yeah, but you can basically call within these credits that you have available, and there's then no need for additional contracting after you enter into the Action Platform initially. When can we pilot the full scope of the Action Platform? So pilots are actually ongoing. And if you're an existing customer, just reach out to us. We are anyway having pilots ongoing and are reaching out to customers. So that is actually already possible. Sebastian, have you seen a question that you can address or want to address?
I think they are all related to you and to Prewave. I really looked into all of them, but
there's one last question. Would you consider the Action Platform as a preventive measure or remedial measure by law? I mean, the Action Platform itself is not a measure. Yeah? The measures that we introduced here, and maybe let's go back into this overview here. Some of these measures can be remedial. Some of these measures are typically only preventive, like a code of conduct, for instance, or a maturity assessment is typically a preventive measure where you try to, let's say, reduce the likelihood of a violation occurring. But same, an awareness training in most cases will be preventive in that you want to reduce the likelihood that, for instance, in the area of cyber risk, we at Prewave host, and we host at least annual awareness trainings with our employees around information security, and that should reduce the likelihood that something happens. Of course, after a violation happened, you would typically go into remediation, and these would be more targeted to the actual violation. So that could be, for instance, we have ability to request information from the supplier, to then have corrective action plans with the supplier. An audit can be part of this corrective action plan, that you ask your supplier for certain measures, and then you check the implementation of those measures. And part of a corrective action plan could, for instance, again, be awareness training or a worker survey that is followed up at a later point to see whether they are really implementing these measures. Yeah. Okay, I think we've worked through most questions. Then I would like to thank everybody for participating. I would also like to thank Sebastian again for participating here in the webinar, but also on the Action Platform. As mentioned, we will send out the follow-up email afterwards with also the link to pre-register for the e-learning and also the slides and the recording of this webinar. And with that, and thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you, Harald.
We also thank all participants and wish you a nice Friday and a good evening, a good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.